message given by extraterrestrials. At last, science replaces religion. Book 2. Extraterrestrials took me to their planet.
Introduction.
When I started this second book, I wanted simply to relate what my life had been like before my fantastic encounter of the 13th of December 1973. That was necessary to answer the many people who had asked, firstly, what I had done before that time, and secondly, whether anything extraordinary had happened to me during my childhood that could have foreshadowed such a destiny. I was surprised myself as I searched my memories, for even though I thought that nothing extraordinary had occurred at the beginning of my life, I found scenes resurfacing which formed a whole when put together, and I saw that my life had really been guided for me to be what I was and to find myself where I did on December 13th, 1973. I had almost finished writing this account when the second encounter took place. Consequently, I have summed up my early memories briefly in order to give as much space as possible to the second part of this message, and to provide a full account of this second contact, which turned out to be even more fantastic than the first.
Chapter 1. My life until the first encounter. 2 years have passed.
2 years. For almost 2 years now I've been trying somehow to radiate this truth, which often seems too great for me. Time goes by and I feel I'm getting nowhere. Yet, little by little, a solid core of people is forming around me. People who understand that the book which tells the truth really does just that. There are 700 of them as I pen these lines. And I understand how this is both few and many at the same time. Few when we consider the 4 billion people who populate the Earth, and many when we consider how few people had decided, after 2 years, to follow the man who, 2,000 years ago, had the equally heavy burden of being initiated and then initiating the primitive people of his time. Who are these 700? Are they, as the scoffers would no doubt love to believe, average simpletons, who could be made to swallow anything? Not at all. Some of them are university graduates or people holding PhDs in philosophy, psychology, theology, sociology, medicine, physics, and chemistry. My admiration perhaps goes as much to those who have no degree, since although they have not acquired knowledge through study that would allow them to realize that living matter and people like us can be created scientifically, they are still able to feel it intuitively, as people capable of mastering matter and putting themselves in harmony with the universe of which they are a part. I must say that I am optimistic on the whole, and that I believe that I have so far led the mission that has been entrusted to me along the right path. For whatever happens to me, MADEC is up and running, and nothing will ever be able to stop it. In 2 years, I have given nearly 40 lectures, and since certain questions come up regularly, I suppose some parts of the message need to be clarified. So I will try to do that in this work. First of all, what sort of life was I leading before the encounter of 13th of December 1973? I have to admit, I've only recently begun to look back on my life to figure out exactly how it had been guided for me to be available and ready to go into action on the spiritual, psychic and emotional levels at that time. Certain events in my childhood had never seemed to me to have the least meaning when taken separately, but they did when taken together. Now it all seems very clear to me, and I am moved when I remember some things that I considered unimportant at the time they occurred. Far be it from me to tell my life story in a way that suggests that each event in it was exceptional, but it seems that many people want to know more about what had happened to me before. Also, rather than leave it to wagging tongues, I would rather tell it all myself.
Childhood. A UFO over Amber.
As the child of an unknown father, I cannot say that I had a typical childhood. I was what is called a natural child, as if all others were artificial children. My birth was an accident, as it were, at least for the little town of Amber, which is so devoutly Catholic that it is known as the world capital of the Rosary. Furthermore, the unknown father, who was not totally unknown, was apparently a Jewish refugee. What sacrilege! My birth was concealed as much as possible, not in a cave, but in a clinic at nearby Vichy. It occurred on 30th of September 1946 at about 2 o'clock in the morning, and was a very difficult one. But the important thing is that I was conceived on 25th of December 1945. Conception, the moment when a being truly begins to exist and develop in the womb of its mother, is the true date of birth for each individual. December 25th has been a very important date for almost 2,000 years now. For those who believe in coincidences, my life began with a coincidence. When we returned to Amber, my poor mother tried for a long while to pass me off as the son of a friend she was taking care of for a while. We lived under the same roof as her father, who, if he held it against her when he learned the truth, proved to be the nicest of grandfathers to me during the short time I knew him. Sadly, he died when I was still a very young child. I was later told about how amused he looked when, having seen him trim his fruit trees, I took a pair of scissors to cut his lettuce. I was raised by my grandmother and my aunt, who were then, and still are, living together. They taught me to read and helped me take my first steps, which I remember very clearly, surely the earliest memory of my life. It was only very recently that my grandmother told me that in 1947, she saw a strange craft flying very quickly and noiselessly over Amber near her house. She had never dared tell anyone about it for fear of being accused of hallucinating. It was only after reading my book that she decided to talk to me about it. And at the same time she decided to join MADEC. Her decision to join was in fact one of the most important forms of encouragement that I received.
The Pope of the Druids.
In Amber, there was an old man of whom small children were afraid, and of whom the grown-ups made fun. They nicknamed him Jesus Christ, because he had very long hair rolled up in a bun and a magnificent beard. He was always clad in a long cape that came down to his ankles, and he lived about 100 meters from the house where my mother had found a small apartment. He did not work, and nobody knew how he could afford to live in the minuscule house in front of the municipal grammar school. As they got older, the children lost their fear of him, and, like their parents, started to make fun of him, laughing and making faces as they followed at his heels. Personally, I did not enjoy playing with the others, preferring to contemplate insects and look at books. I had passed this man in the street several times, and had been surprised by his face, which radiated great kindness, and by the mischievous smile he wore whenever he looked at me. I did not know why, but he did not scare me, and I did not see anything laughable about him. Also, I did not understand why the other children made fun of him. One afternoon I followed him, curious about where he was going, and saw him go into his house, leaving open the door that led into a small, very dark kitchen. I went closer, and could see him sitting on a stool, with the mischievous smile on his face, as if he were expecting me. He motioned for me to come nearer. I went inside the house and moved towards him. He laid his hands on my head, and I felt a strange sensation. At the same time, he looked up in the air and uttered some words that I did not understand. After a few minutes had passed, he let me go, still without saying a word, and still smiling the same mysterious smile. All this had me puzzled at the time, but I very quickly forgot about it. It was only in the summer of 1974, when reading a book that my mother had lent me about the mysteries of Auvergne, that I learnt that Father Dissard, the old man in question, was the last Dissard, that is, the last living pope of the Druids, and that he had been dead for several years. Then I recalled a scene from my childhood, and thought again of the mysterious smile that the old man used to give me each time I passed him in the street, which was every day since we'd been virtually neighbours. I now know exactly who he was addressing when he looked up in the air and uttered those mysterious phrases, just as I know exactly what the silent, luminous machine was that my grandmother had seen. One other thing also comes to mind again. After the scene that took place at Father Dissard's house, I went to sleep every evening counting up to 9 a certain number of times. This is a number that has frequently come up in my life, like a code that has been assigned to me. I've never been able to explain this sudden habit, which began several years after I'd learned to count much higher than 9, and therefore could not have been the result of learning by rote. I was 7 years old when this incident took place.
Poetry.
At that time, what mattered most to me were animals, which I loved to draw all day long. When I was not organising snail races, I was fascinated by animal life, and I dreamt then only of becoming an explorer so as to be able to get near the mysterious fauna of the virgin forest. But at 9 years of age, the number 9 again, everything was to change. First of all, I was discovering what was to become a true passion for me: speed. Speed, that is, on everything with wheels, with or without an engine. Speed, and especially balance. The feeling of motion and the struggle against oneself, against one's own reflexes. In fact, the ultimate mastery of mind over body. It started with wild downhill runs on a little bicycle with almost no brakes, and I wonder how it was that I did not fall a single time. To liven things up, I would position myself at the top of a hill and wait for a fast car to pass by. Then I would launch into a dizzying pursuit, catch up with the car and pass it, to the driver's great surprise. And once at the bottom of the hill, I would turn and go back to wait at the top for another car. A few months later, I found myself by chance attending the Tour de France motor race, and it was love at first sight. It was possible, I then realised, to know the joys of high speed without having to pedal back up a hill. And you could make it your job. I made up my mind, the way you can when you are 9 years old. I would be a racing driver. From that day on, my life was centred only around motor racing. Nothing else interested me, and I did not see the point of learning all they taught me at school, since I was going to be a racing driver. Children's comics were replaced by serious motor magazines, and I impatiently began counting off the years that separated me from the age when I could obtain a driving licence. It was also at the age of 9 that I had my first experience of boarding school. My mother was in despair, because I no longer wanted to do anything at school, and I constantly told her that such learning was useless for motor racing drivers. So she decided to send me to the Notre Dame de France boarding school at Puy-en-Velay. She hoped that without motor racing magazines I would apply myself to schoolwork, and in a way she was not far wrong. But I have very bad memories of that first boarding school, almost certainly because I was too young when I was sent there. I remember that I spent many nights crying in a huge dormitory, where what I now believe I missed most was the chance to be alone and meditate. This need, which caused me to spend entire nights crying, further increased my already great sensitivity, as will any emotional need that is denied. Then I discovered poetry. I had always been more attracted to literature than to mathematics, although only as an interested and passive reader. Then came the desire, the need to write, in verse if possible. I remained uninterested in mathematics, yet I had now achieved a solid average in that subject, as in all others. But in French language, and especially writing, I regularly came first, as long as I liked the set subject. I even wrote an entire collection of poems and won first prize in a poetry competition. The most surprising thing was that, even though I had not been baptized, I was in a private boarding school run by Catholic monks, with all the praying which that involves. Prayers before eating and going to bed, before rising in the morning, before studying, and attending daily mass with communion. When after 6 months of daily communion, the brethren discovered that I had not been baptized, they seemed utterly horrified. I actually thought it was funny. It was in fact the only part of their mass that I liked, this free tasting of morsels of bread. It was also at the age of 9 that I attained puberty. I enjoyed it very much, and discovering unknown and secret pleasures which no other 9-year-old in the dormitory seemed yet to know about was some consolation for my incomplete solitude. Finally, it was at the age of 9 that I fell in love for the first time, and it was the intense kind of love that can seize children at that age. Due to my improved classroom results, my mother had agreed not to send me back to boarding school, and I found myself in the 4th grade at the municipal grammar school in Ambert. There she was, 9 years old, or almost, and her name was Bridget. I was shy and blushed quite ridiculously. It took only a glance during a medical visit, or perhaps a gesture of modesty to hide a non-existent bosom from my eyes, to realise in me feelings of tenderness and a great desire to protect this so evidently fragile being. The following year, I found myself at the same school in the 5th grade, in the company of my first love, to whom I dared not even speak. Still, I managed to end up sitting one desk in front of her at the beginning of the school year so that I could turn my head from time to time and admire her beloved face. I was only 10 and was always thinking about her. The fact that I was close to her in class spurred me on, and I set myself to work hard enough to avoid having to repeat a year. In this way, I moved up to the 6th grade without the least interest in my studies. Unfortunately, We were now constantly changing classes and had different teachers instead of just one. As a result, I was almost always separated from her and did practically no work. So much so that the next year I found myself back in a boarding school in the small village of Kunlat, which is about 30 kilometres from Amber. It was even worse there than it had been at Plain Valley. We were all crammed into a tiny dormitory that was barely heated, and worst of all, there was virtually no discipline, so the biggest and strongest boys enforced their own law. I think that is where I developed such a hatred of violence. One day, fed up with being bullied by boys against whom no disciplinary measures were ever taken, I took to the road on foot, determined to cover the 30 kilometres that separated me from my maternal home. Nobody noticed my departure, and when the school principal caught up with me in his car, I'd already walked nearly 10 kilometres. To my great delight, I was kicked out of the school and sent back to the Catholic Brethren at Amber in the middle of the school year as a day boy. What joy! I could now see Bridget every day in the street. By then she was 12. Her small bosom was budding deliciously, and to me she was more beautiful than ever. I grew less and less interested in my studies and began to taste the joys of playing truant, mainly because I did not like finding myself back amongst the priests, who had quickly advised my mother to have me baptized. Fortunately, she preferred to wait until I was old enough to understand so that she could ask my opinion. What I would have liked at that time was to become a garage mechanic, because I had learned that it was a useful skill for racing drivers. My mother, who hoped I would become an engineer, wanted me at all costs to continue with my studies, so she would not allow me to become apprenticed to a garage. Renewed experience of bullying gave me the desire to write poems again, and I started pacing about in the country with a notebook in my hand instead of attending classes. At 14, I found myself back in a boarding school once more, this time in Mont d'Or, at a grammar school where they take children not wanted by any of the other schools in the region. I found myself in the company of a fairly interesting collection of dunces and hard cases. It was one of the latter, a typical boarding school big shot, who ended up being responsible for the direction I took during the next 10 years of my life. His name was Jacques, and he played the electric guitar, which quite impressed me. As soon as the Christmas holidays came, I got my grandmother to buy me a magnificent guitar, and Jacques taught me a few chords. Then I started setting my poems to music, and noticed that it was apparently very pleasing to those who listened. As soon as the summer holidays came, I began to enter some radio singing contests, which I almost always won. It was also during that summer vacation that I discovered physical love for the first time, with a barmaid who had been enchanted by my songs. She was 20 years old and did not teach me much apart from the effects that the guitar can have on women. The following year, I was 15 and wanted more than ever to live my own life. One day, I took my guitar under my arm along with a small suitcase, said farewell to the boarding school with its uninteresting studies, and hitchhiked to Paris. I had 2,000 old francs in my pocket and a heart full of hope. At last, I was going to earn my own living, save up enough money to take my driving test at the age of 18 and become a racing driver. By a stroke of luck, a man driving a car that had tremendous acceleration hidden beneath discreet-looking bodywork picked me up. When he told me he was a racing driver and gave me his name, I was able to tell him which car he had driven and the awards he had won. He was flattered and surprised, little known as he was, to meet a young boy who remembered all his achievements. He told me that he had once been a clown, and that he now owned a garage in the southwest. When we arrived in Paris, he invited me out to dinner, and even offered me a room in the hotel where he was staying. In the lounge, we chatted a bit with two young women who were dance hostesses in a bar and had finished their day's work. I sang some songs, and then we went to bed, each with one of our charming companions. There I was, truly initiated into physical lovemaking. The next morning, I left discreetly because I wanted to find a room and some cabarets that would be interested in my songs. I did not find either, and spent my second night in Paris in the subway with the tramps. I had not a penny left, and the next morning I was starving. I spent my day dawdling and despairing of ever sorting anything out. But that evening, I saw a man playing an accordion on a cafe terrace, and the customers were throwing him coins. I decided to try the same thing, and right from the start it worked very well. I was saved. I lived like that for 3 years, often sleeping anywhere and eating a sandwich from time to time. But I made enormous progress, and one day I was hired by a small cabaret on the left bank. I made 10 francs each night and needed 15 for the taxi ride back to Montmartre, where I lived in a small room. Yet I had my name on the poster, although in small print. Already, I was imagining my name high up on the poster in big letters, seeing the success I was having every night. One day, I met the actor Jean-Pierre Darras, who advised me to take acting classes to improve my stage presence. Since I did not have the means to pay for them, he kindly arranged for me to attend a course at the National Theatre of Paris free of charge. So, for 3 months, I took the Dullin course, and then gave it up because I did not feel at all attracted to the theatre. I used to introduce myself at the time under the pseudonym of Claude Seller, which I had chosen as a tribute to the skier and champion racing driver, Tony Seller. I modified the spelling so that my initials would become CC, retaining my real first name. I began to win a lot of radio contests, and by singing in several cabarets, I was able to live reasonably well, and more importantly, to save up enough money to take my driving test at exactly 18 as planned. But that was not enough to become a racing driver. First, I had to make a name for myself in the hope of being hired by a major company, and for that, I needed to have a competition car, participate in some races independently, and, if possible, win them. A racing car is very expensive, and I had to continue saving in the hope of acquiring such a vehicle. I continued with my singing and tried to put some money aside. Many writer-composer friends had made recordings and seemed to be making a lot of money from them, so I decided to try it, having by now more than 150 songs in my bag. The first recording firm that I approached offered me a 3-year contract which I signed. The director of the recording firm was Lucien Morris, the director of the radio station Europe No. 1, which had launched a tremendous number of famous singers. My first record was fairly successful, and the second, thanks to a song called La miel et la cannelle, honey and cinnamon, was even more popular. It was often heard on the radio. Honey and cinnamon. I smell honey and cinnamon, I smell vanilla and love. I smell honey and cinnamon, girls I'll always adore. The first was a brunette, Margot was her name. We played the pipes as the moon lit the night. I took the road to her eyes and followed the way to her hair. The second was a blonde, her name was Rael. The path around her curves I remember well. I took the road to her eyes and followed the way to her hair. The third was a redhead, Marion she was called, and for her lovely little face and her frothy underslip, I took the road to her eyes and followed the way to her hair. Don't cry, my friend, for tomorrow will be spring. They are so lovely and you're not 20 yet. I took the road to her eyes, and you can travel the path to her hair. I was giving many performances and taking part in many roadshows. Everything was going well, and I even had the pleasure of being selected to participate in the Golden Rose Song Contest held in Antibes. But those who were guiding me did not really want me to become too famous an artist. That stage of my life had been planned to develop my sensitivity and to accustom me to expressing myself in public, but no more than that. Even though the fact that I was among the contestants selected for the Golden Rose and was being announced on the radio every morning, Lucien Morris came to me one day and explained to me that he had to withdraw me from the contest. He said that I would understand why later, but he could not tell me more at that moment. So, in the end, I did not participate in the Golden Rose contest, but had to continue to live on what I could earn from my singing, which I realised would never be enough to buy a car that would get me into racing. Therefore, when I was offered the opportunity to become a representative for the company where I did my recordings, I accepted immediately, convinced that I would be able to save up enough for a car in a few months. I found myself back in Bordeaux, where I was a commercial agent in charge of 15 regions. I stayed there for a year and left when I at last had enough money to buy myself a competition car. I just had time to break that car in before a friend wrote it off in an accident. However, I had composed new songs during the year in Bordeaux, and a wealthy friend urged me to make another record, which he would finance himself. I spent another year living on my poetry, and then, as if to make me change my lifestyle radically, I was involved in a very serious car accident. On a very tiring tour, I fell asleep at the wheel of my car and struck a wall head-on at about 100 kilometers per hour, 60 miles an hour. More than 10 people had already died at that spot. I came out of it with several fractures, but alive. I was immobilized for 3 months or more, and my savings ran out. I was still not racing. I, who had dreamt of starting out at 18, had still not entered a single race by the age of 22. Having been to racing circuits many times as a spectator, I had noticed how infatuated young people were with this sport, and also the number of boys who wanted to be racing drivers without knowing how to proceed. I did not know much more than they did, and told myself that the best way for me to enter the racing scene would be to find a career that took advantage of their enthusiasm. I knew how to write, so the solution was obvious. I would become a reporter for a sports car magazine. I got in touch with a number of specialist magazines, but in vain, because so many other enthusiasts had come up with the same idea. Then I noticed a small advertisement in the motor section of L'Equipe from someone looking for photographer reporters, no experience required. I wrote, and the advertiser replied saying that my application was being considered, but that I had to send 150 francs for administrative costs. In exchange, I would receive some film to make a test report on a subject of my choice. I sent the money, got back the film and wrote the report, on a motor race, of course, and immediately sent it to the address indicated. Very soon afterwards, I received a letter asking me to call a number in Dijon, where the head office of the firm that had placed the advertisement was situated. I met the head of the publishing company, a man of about 30 years of age who claimed to have made a fortune in photography in the United States. He seemed to be very interested in my ideas about the creation of a sports car magazine intended for young people who hoped to become racing drivers, and offered to hire me as editor-in-chief of a newspaper that was to come out in a few months' time. He showed me the factory that he was going to buy to set up his printing office, introduced me to the printer in Dijon whom he had hired to be the director, and showed me the house where my wife and I could live at a stone's throw from my office. I replied that it would suit me, provided I could cover and participate in races. He then told me that he was also looking for someone capable of running a competitions department, since he intended to launch the new newspaper by racing some cars painted in his own colours. That would enable me to be right where the action was, and I agreed to be the director of the competitions department for this company. A week later, I moved from Paris to Dijon with my wife, Marie-Paul. I had been married for about 3 months, and she was expecting our daughter. I had met Marie-Paul in the month of June, and we had not left each other's side since the first day we met. We had married 3 months later, only because her family was shocked to learn that we had no intentions of getting married religiously. Her family was very old-fashioned, and at first I prayed with them before meals. My stay in Dijon, however, lasted only 2 months, and I received no salary. It transpired that the rich American who had wanted to create a newspaper had in fact just come out of prison without a penny. He had swindled sums of money ranging from 150 francs to 300 francs from more than 500 young people dreaming, like me, of becoming racing drivers or photographer reporters. I had worked for 2 months for nothing, and I found myself full of ideas but penniless. This time, I decided to make a start alone in the great world of publishing. I moved to Clermont-Ferrand, close to my mother who was then looking forward to becoming a grandparent very soon, and started my own publishing house to produce a magazine in my own way. Copies of that magazine were soon on sale, thanks to a printer who also loved sports cars and who agreed to take the risk of extending me credit, although I could not give him any form of guarantee. The magazine took off quickly and soon became one of the leaders in its field. I reserved for myself the most interesting task, test driving new models on the magnificent circuit Made de Clos, a cruise, and on the road. By this means, I gained entry into the world of motorsport and cars were lent to me to race. At last my dream was becoming a reality, and what is more, I found from the start that I was a gifted competition driver, gaining many victories with cars that were unfamiliar to me. For 3 marvellous years I lived like this, all the time making continuous progress with my driving technique and concentrating 100% on the field that I loved, that of sports cars. I must say that I felt a real pleasure in steadily pushing back my limitations and constantly improving control of my reflexes and reactions. However, I did not care for either engine noise or the smell of burning fuel, and I dreamt of days to come when racing car manufacturers would be required to make their cars odourless and noiseless. Only then could I enjoy fully the sensation of driving at its purest level. But all of this was turned upside down towards the end of 1973.
The encounter.
On that extraordinary day, 13th of December 1973, I found myself in a crater of an Auvergne volcano, the Puy de la Solace. There, as I've already described, I met for the first time an extraterrestrial man, or more precisely, the Eloha, singular for Elohim, whom I would meet at the same place for 6 consecutive days, and who, for about 1 hour each time, would dictate to me the fantastic revelations of the first part of this message. For the first few days following this experience, I must confess I wondered if I would dare tell anyone at all about it. The first thing I did was to make a neat copy of the notes that I had taken as best I could, although far too quickly as my interlocutor spoke to me. When this was finished, I sent the original manuscript to a serious publisher, who to my knowledge did not publish esoteric works or science fiction. Obviously, I did not want this message of such importance to humanity to be lost among collections of mysterious adventure stories or occult books that cater for people interested in alternative sciences. Marcel Julien, who ran the publishing house, invited me to Paris and told me that the manuscript was sensational, but he said that I must tell my life story before talking about the message, and that there might be a few little changes to be made. All that was absolutely out of the question. I did not want to take up 100 pages telling my life story and then present the message that I had received as if my personality were as important as those things which I had been asked to reveal. I wanted the message published, but only the message, even if it was not a thick book and thereby lacked interest for a publisher. So, I asked Monsieur Julien to return my manuscript. He replied that he did not have it because a reader had borrowed it, but that as soon as it was returned he would mail it to me. I had just returned to Clermont-Ferrand when I received a telegram inviting me to return to Paris to appear in a television show named The Great Chessboard, presented by Jacques Chancel. He was the director of a series in the publishing house to which I had sent my manuscript. He had read it and understood that it was absolutely fantastic, whether anyone believed it or not. So I took part in the show, and the thousands of letters that I received afterwards showed that, while some laughed, many had taken what I said very seriously and wanted to help. But days went by, and my manuscript was not returned. I sent a registered letter to the publisher, who replied that the manuscript would be sent to me, but that they had not yet found it. After 10 days, I went back to Paris to see if I could do something personally, because nobody wanted to answer my questions anymore when I telephoned to ask about the matter. The famous designer, Courage, who had contacted me after the television show because he was interested, agreed to come with me to see the publisher in order to find out what exactly had become of the manuscript. Marcel Julien told us that the reader who had the manuscript had taken it with him on holiday, but they did not know where he was or how to reach him. The situation was becoming stranger and stranger. In the end, the manuscript was retrieved by Monsieur Courage, and he returned it to me personally. I still wonder if it had really been lost, or just put away to prevent it from being published. If that publishing house really mislaid the manuscript so easily, then I would discourage other authors from sending their originals to them. Alarmed by the mishap, and by the growing pile of letters from people interested in buying the book containing the messages as soon as it was published, Marie Paul offered to leave her nursing job to help me with the publishing and the distribution of this exceptional document. I accepted, because I was sure that only in this way would I be able permanently to control the use to which these writings were put. Since it was incompatible with the seriousness of the mission that I had been given, I immediately stopped working for the sports magazine, and in the autumn of 1974 the book finally rolled off the printing press. The shock to my nervous system caused by this unforeseen upset in my life had given me stomach pains and almost brought on an ulcer. All winter I suffered from a serious case of gastritis. No medication was effective, and it was only after I decided to take it easy by doing some meditation and breathing exercises that the pains vanished as if by magic. In June, I'd been on a television show hosted by Philippe Bouvard. It was called Saturday Evening, and, sarcastic as always, Monsieur Bouvard disguised his co-host as a Martian, with pink antennae and a green suit, and asked me if he looked like the person I had met. But many people, interested by the little I'd been able to say, wrote to Philippe Bouvard reproaching him for his lack of seriousness. Confronted by the thousands of letters he received, he decided to invite me back to do another show where I would be able to say a little more. Convinced that I would not be allowed to say enough, I decided to hire the Pleyel Hall for a date just after the television show and to announce to interested viewers that I would give a talk there in a few days' time. I hired a hall to seat 150, with an option on another to seat 500, as I did not know how many people would want to bother to come and listen to me. In the end, more than 3,000 people came. Quite obviously, we could only accommodate 500 in the hall I had booked, and when these seats were filled, we advised the others that I would give another talk in a few days in the Great Hall with 2,000 seats. Obviously, many people were not happy to leave, some of them having travelled several hundred kilometres. It all went well, and I found that a great number of people were ready to help and support me. Apart, of course, from those cynics whose questions, by virtue of their superficiality, I was able to show up as ridiculous, even though I had dreadful stage fright, much more than I had ever had when singing. Everything went without a hitch, and the answers to the most difficult questions seemed to come to my lips by themselves. I really felt help coming from above, just as the Elohim had promised me. I had the impression of listening to myself give answers that I could not possibly have come up with alone. The second talk took place a few days later. I was afraid that those who had not been able to get into the hall the first time would not come back, and that I would therefore find myself stuck with a very expensive hall nearly 3/4 empty. There had not been any publicity about it since the television programme, except for a short 3-line paragraph in François, the only newspaper that would agree to publicise this second talk. In the event, well over 2,000 people came and the hall was full. It was a triumph. From this time onwards, I did not have any further doubts about the success of my mission.
The public talks.
From the month of September 1974 onwards, over the course of some 40 lectures, I was able to see which questions came up most frequently. I also saw the membership of MADEC rising constantly as regional offices formed in all the big towns of France around the most dynamic and active members. I also saw some reporters pursuing their craft honestly and well, their job being to inform the public by writing or saying exactly what they had seen or read about. However, some, like those from the newspaper Le Point, wrote lies, even after registered letters were sent to remind them that they had to rectify an inaccurate article in conformity with the right to respond. They did not do so properly. Others, like those at the newspaper La Montagne, simply refused to inform their readers that I was giving a talk in Clermont-Ferrand, and exploited the fact that they were the only daily newspaper in that region. Their news director had in fact met me and said that never would my activities or I be mentioned in his newspaper. All this was because they did not like the fact that when I appeared initially on television, I had not first informed them before talking to a major French broadcasting organisation. A sad story and a fine example of freedom of speech. They even refused to run a paid advertisement announcing that talk, although in the same newspaper there were full-page advertisements for pornographic movies. As for the newspaper Le Point, it simply transformed an excursion of MADEC members to the place where the encounter had occurred into a broken appointment with the Elohim. These tricks were played in an attempt to ridicule an organisation trying to get off the ground. It is evidently easier and less dangerous for a newspaper with an extensive readership to do this to a new organisation like MADEC than to the Church with its 2,000-year history. But the day will come when those who have tried to hide or twist the truth will regret their mistakes.
Chapter 2. The Second Encounter. The sighting of 31st of July, 1975.
It was during June 1975 that I decided to resign as president of MADEC. First of all, because it seemed that the movement could now manage very well without me. And secondly, because I thought I had made a mistake in structuring the organisation in accordance with a 1901 law that likened the movement, which is of such importance to humanity, to a pétanque club or a war veterans association. I thought it was necessary to create a movement more in harmony with the fantastic messages that the Elohim had transmitted to me. This required a movement that respected to the letter what our creators had advised, namely geniocracy, humanitarianism, the renunciation of all deistic religious practices, and so on. Any association based on that 1901 law ran contrary to the meaning of the Elohim's message by definition, at least in the way we had structured it. Since all members of such an association could vote, we were not respecting the principles of geniocracy according to which only the most intelligent people may take part in making decisions. So, I had to correct this fundamental mistake, not by going so far as to abolish MADEC, but rather to transform it, pending more effective modification of its structure. This would not run contrary to the regulations of the 1901 law. In this way, MADEC would become an organisation that would support the real movement that I was going to create with its most open-minded members. In effect, a congregation of MADEC guides. This new association would bring together those people who wish to open others' minds to infinity and eternity, and become guides for humanity by scrupulously applying what was required in the Elohim's message. So, in a society seeking to close people's minds in every way with deistic religion, soporific education, unthinking television programs and petty political battles, I was going to try to initiate people who would go out into the world and attempt to open the minds of others. Thus, MADEC would retain its importance by becoming a support organisation that would be the first point of contact for those discovering the Elohim's message. It would be made up of practicing members, and the Congregation of Guides was going to be a movement made up of monks, guiding those practicing members. I knew that there were people among the MADEC members who were quite capable of managing the organisation, and I received confirmation of this during the elections to the Administrative Council. My replacement as president, Christian, was a physicist with a promising future, and the rest of the council was made up of people who were all equally representative and competent. It was also in the month of June that Francois, one of the most devoted MADEC members and one of the most open-minded, came to see me in Clermont-Ferrand. I told him about my desire to find a country house in as secluded a place as possible, in order to rest a little and calmly write a book in which I would relate all that had happened to me prior to the 13th of December 1973, before anyone could invent a lot of nonsense about my past. He told me that he had a farm in an out-of-the-way place in Périgord, and that if I liked the area, I could spend a month or two there, and even stay as long as I wished since nobody lived there. We immediately drove off to visit the place, and inspired by the peace and quiet that I found there, I decided to stay for 2 months. After 2 weeks, I was enjoying it so much that I seriously considered settling there more permanently. Francois came back to join us at the end of July, and we started planning the move for the day after the celebration meeting at Clermont-Ferrand on the 6th of August. I still had not decided for sure, because I was afraid I might fail in my mission somehow if I moved away from the place of my marvellous encounter. However, on the 31st of July, while my wife, Marie-Paul, and Francois and I were out getting some fresh air, we saw what must have been an enormous craft passing silently and with jerky movements almost over the house. At times it moved with unimaginable speed, but it also stopped suddenly several times, proceeding in a zigzag pattern like this about 500 metres from where we stood. I was delighted that other people were with me to witness the event, and an indescribable feeling of happiness came over me. Francois told me that the hairs on his head stood on end from emotion. To me, it was an obvious sign of the Elohim's consent to my moving to that area. The next morning, I noticed that I had a strange mark on the bicep of one arm, close to the fold of my elbow. I did not immediately make the connection to the sighting of the day before, but later many people told me that it could only have been a mark made by the Elohim. It was a red circle about 3 centimetres in diameter. Its circumference was 5 millimetres thick, and inside it were 3 smaller circles. This mark stayed the same for the next 2 weeks. Then the 3 circles in the middle merged into one, making 2 concentric circles. Then, after another 2 weeks, the 2 circles disappeared, leaving a white spot on my arm, which I still have. I wish to emphasise the fact that I never suffered from that mark, and that I did not feel the least itching during the entire time I had it. Some open-minded scientists to whom I showed the mark speculated that it could have been made while a sample was being taken with the help of a perfected laser. The reunion of August 6th finally took place as planned in the crater of Puy de la Solace near Clermont-Ferrand, and at that meeting a splendid feeling of fraternity and harmony prevailed. I had decided to hold this gathering of MADEC members on this date without really knowing why, but in fact the Elohim had guided me, because on the day of the meeting some members informed me that it was the 30th anniversary to the day of the atomic bomb explosion at Hiroshima, and that it was also a Christian holiday, the Transfiguration. Fools will say that it was a coincidence. After that meeting, some MADEC members helped me to move, and I settled down to live in Périgord.
The Message, Part 2.
On October 7th at around 11 o'clock at night, I felt a sudden urge to go out and look at the sky. I dressed warmly because it was rather cool and set out walking in the dark. I was going in a certain direction without being conscious of it, and suddenly felt the need to go to a spot that Francois had shown me during the summer, a deserted place between 2 brooks and surrounded by forest. It was called the Roc Plat. I reached it around midnight, half wondering what I was doing there, but following my intuition since I'd been told that I could be guided telepathically. The sky was magnificent, and stars were shining everywhere, for there was not a single cloud to be seen. As I stood watching the shooting stars, the whole countryside suddenly lit up, and I saw a huge ball of fire behind some bushes. I moved towards the place where the ball of fire had appeared, filled with a tremendous joy as I was almost certain of what I was going to find. The same craft that I had seen on 6 occasions in the month of December 1973 was there in front of me, and the same person I had met 2 years earlier came towards me with a smile full of kindness. I noticed one difference right away. He no longer had on the spacesuit that had seemed to make a halo around his face the first time. After all the time I had spent trying to make the world understand that I was indeed telling the truth, I was wonderfully happy to see once more the person who had been responsible for turning my life upside down. I bowed before him, and he spoke. "Stand up and follow me," he said. "We are very satisfied with you and everything that you have done for the past 2 years. It is now time to pass on to the next stage, since you have proven to us that we can trust you. These 2 years were in fact just a trial. You can see that today I have no protection around my face, and that my craft appeared to you all at once and was not equipped with flashing lights. All of that was only intended to reassure you, so that I would appear in a way that corresponds to the image that you generally have of space travelers. But now that you are sufficiently evolved not to take fright, we won't use such approach techniques anymore." Following him inside the craft, I noticed that its interior looked very similar to what I had found at our first meeting. Walls with the same metallic appearance as the outside, no control board or instruments, no portholes, and a floor made of a translucent blue substance on which stood 2 armchairs. These were made of a transparent material that reminded me a little of inflatable plastic chairs, but without feeling unpleasant. He invited me to sit down in one of the 2 chairs, settled into the other, and asked me not to move. He then pronounced a few words in an incomprehensible language, and I seemed to feel the machine rock slightly. Then all of a sudden, I felt a sensation of severe cold, as if my whole body were turning to a block of ice, or rather as if thousands of ice crystals were penetrating all the pores of my skin, right down to the marrow of my bones. It lasted a very short time, a few seconds perhaps, and I felt nothing after that. Then my companion rose and said, "You may come. We have arrived." I followed him down the small stairway. The craft stood motionless in a metallic-looking circular room about 15 meters in diameter and 10 meters high. A door opened, and my guide told me to go in and undress completely. After that, I would receive further instructions. I went into a new circular room that did not have the slightest angle, and must have been about 4 meters in diameter. I undressed, and a voice told me to go into the room that was in front of me. At that moment a door opened, and I went into a room similar to the one where I had left my clothes, but it was long and a little like a corridor. Along the length of that corridor, I passed under lights of different colours in turn. The voice then told me that by following the arrows painted on the floor, I would arrive in yet another room where a bath awaited me. In this next room, I did indeed find a sunken bathtub. The water was lukewarm, just right, and discreetly perfumed. The voice advised me to satisfy my personal needs, which I did, and then it asked me to drink the contents of a glass located on a small shelf by the metallic wall. It was a white liquid deliciously savoured with almonds and very cold. Then some soft pyjama-like clothes that felt like silk were offered to me. They were white, very close-fitting, and had been laid out ready for me on another shelf. At last, a final door opened and I found my guide again. He was escorted by 2 people who were of similar appearance to him, but with different features, and they were every bit as welcoming. I rejoined them in a huge hall where I found wonder after wonder. It was arranged on several levels and must have measured 100 meters in diameter. It was covered by an absolutely transparent dome, so transparent that at first sight it was not clear even that it was a dome. Thousands of stars studded the dark sky, and yet the entire hall was brightly lit with a soft, natural-looking light as if it were midday. The floor was covered with furs and shaggy carpets of astounding, enchanting colours. The most admirable works of art were everywhere, each one more beautiful than the last, and some had animated and changing colours. Elsewhere there were plants, some bright red and others blue, as beautiful as exotic fish but several meters tall. Background music was playing that sounded like an organ and a musical saw, with occasional choirs and bass voices producing extraordinary vibrations. This music made the flowers bend and sway in rhythm, and they changed colours with each change of musical style. Every time someone spoke, the music grew softer so that we could hear each other without difficulty and without having to raise our voices. The air was perfumed with 1,000 scents that also changed with the music and our position in the room. The whole area had been designed with about 10 angled corners which were separated at different levels, and each corner had a particular character. A small stream meandered through all this. My guide's two companions were showing him great respect, and the next thing he said to me was, "Follow me. We shall make ourselves comfortable, since I have many things to tell you." I followed him to a group of armchairs and sofas made of a very soft black fur, where all four of us sat down. There my guide spoke again. "Today, I'm going to give you a second message that will complete the one that I dictated to you in December 1973. You don't have anything to take notes with, but don't worry. Everything that I say to you will remain engraved in your mind, because here we have a technique that allows you to remember everything you hear. First of all, we wish to congratulate you for all that you have done over the past 2 years, but we also wish to warn you that the rest of your mission may be more difficult. But never be discouraged in any case, because you will be rewarded for your efforts, whatever happens now. To begin with, we must correct a passage in the first message we gave you that you wrongly transcribed concerning an eventual intervention on our part to destroy humanity. It must be made clear that we will not intervene. Humanity is now arriving at a turning point in its history, and its future depends only on itself. If you can control your aggressiveness towards each other and your environment, then you will reach a golden age of interplanetary civilization, in which universal happiness and fulfillment will be realized. If, on the other hand, your civilization gives way to violence, then it will destroy itself, either directly or indirectly through all this. No scientific or technical problem is insurmountable for human genius, as long as human genius is in control. But someone with a deficient brain can threaten worldwide peace, just as a person of genius can bring the world happiness. The sooner you set up geniocracy, the sooner you will remove the possibility of a cataclysm caused by people with minds that are not very evolved. In the event of a cataclysm destroying humanity, only the people who follow you will be saved, and they will have to repopulate the devastated earth when all the danger has been dispersed, as happened in Noah's time.
Buddhism.
My guide paused briefly, then he continued. Buddhism explains that at the time of death, the soul of the dead person must be vigilant enough to escape numerous devils, otherwise it will be reincarnated and fall back into the cycle. On the other hand, if it manages to escape those infamous devils, it will be liberated from the cycle and attain a state of bliss through awakening. In fact, this is a very good description, which applies not to the individual, but to humanity as a whole. It must resist those devils, which can make it fall back into the cycle each time it is in the position to choose. Those devils are aggressiveness directed against our fellow human beings or against nature, and the state of bliss through awakening is a golden age of civilization in which science serves the people, thus producing an earthly paradise where the blind can see and the deaf can hear by scientific means. If humanity is not sufficiently wary of these devils, it will fall back into the cycle of reincarnation, where it must start all over again from a primitive state and advance progressively towards a more evolved society in a hostile world, with all the suffering which that entails. That is why the swastika figures in our symbol, as in numerous ancient writings symbolizing this cycle. It is the choice between paradise, which the peaceful use of science makes possible, and the hell of returning to the primitive stage where humanity submits to nature instead of dominating and benefiting from it. In a way, this is natural selection at the cosmic level for species that are capable of leaving their planet. Only those who perfectly control their aggressiveness can reach this stage. The others self-destruct as soon as their scientific and technological levels permit them to invent weapons powerful enough to do so. That is why we never fear those who come from elsewhere to contact us. Thousands of contacts have confirmed this absolute rule in the universe. People capable of escaping their planetary system are always peaceful. When a species is capable of leaving its own solar system, it means that it has overcome the progress-destruction cycle that can occur when mastery of its own aggressive tendencies is lacking. At the same time that you discover powerful energy sources allowing you to travel beyond your own solar system, you also become capable of creating offensive weapons of irreversible destructive power. Your region of the terrestrial globe, France, is already on the right track in its attempt to unite Europe, and it should be the first country without an army. France would thus set an example for the entire world. Its military professionals would then lay the foundation for a peacekeeping European army, eventually transforming it into a world peace corps. Instead of being the guardians of war, the military would then be the guardians of peace, a title deserving infinitely more respect. It is necessary for an important country to show the way for others to follow, and France's neighbouring countries will not invade her just because she has abolished compulsory military service and is using her professional army in the service of the Europe that she is trying to construct. On the contrary, this would very quickly cause other countries to follow suit and pursue the same path taken by your country. Once Europe is united militarily, creating a single European currency can unite its economy. Then the same process could be applied throughout the world, adding, as we have already told you in the first message, a single world language that would become compulsory in every school on earth. If one country must show the way, then France is that country. It is by advocating a deterrent force that we accumulate the arms of our own destruction, with each country wishing to deter some other country, and in practice never quite knowing which one. An unfortunate action could then threaten to transform that deterrent force into a force of intervention which could be fatal to the whole world. It is through the past that humanity views the future. This is a mistake. We should instead be critical of the past and build the present for the future, rather than build the present on the basis of the past. You must understand that barely 30 years ago, people of countries that are now advanced were still primitive. You are only just emerging. There are millions of people on Earth who are still primitive and incapable of seeing something in the sky as anything other than a divine manifestation. Moreover, you know that deistic religions are still very strong in all the economically less developed countries. You must not revere people for their age, but for their intelligence, while seeing to it that old people have a pleasant life. Our distant ancestors should not be respected, and furthermore they should be seen as an example of poor, limited, primitive people who were unable to open themselves to the universe and who were incapable of handing down very much of value from one generation to the next.
Neither God nor soul.
My guide went on to say, the more primitive a society is, the more deistic religions will flourish within it. These religions are actually cultivated by visitors from other planets who have no other way of peacefully visiting worlds that have not yet overcome their aggressiveness. If you reach the stage where you become evolved visitors on primitive worlds, you will be forced to use such a system, which is in fact very amusing and involves passing yourself off as gods in their eyes. In fact, this is extremely easy, since for primitive people, if you come from the sky, you can only be divine. Of course, you must lay it on a bit thick to be respected and pleasantly received, which does no harm. We continue to make appearances on Earth to see if this still works, and to see the reaction of public authorities, governments and the press. We often amuse ourselves quite a lot. As we have already explained to you in the first part of this message, there is no God, and obviously no soul. After death, there is nothing, unless science is used to create something. As you know, it is possible to recreate a dead organism from one of the organism's cells, which contains its physical and intellectual blueprint. We have noted that an organism loses a few grams at the moment of its death. In fact, this is merely the energy that all living things have available to them, which is eliminated at that moment. As you know, energy, like matter, has weight. You also know that we have discovered that there is organized, intelligent life on the level of the infinitely small, quite certainly as evolved as we are and comparable to what we are ourselves. We have been able to prove this. From there, we have discovered that the stars and planets are the atoms of a gigantic being, which itself certainly contemplates other stars with curiosity. It is also highly likely that the people living on the infinitely small levels of the infinitely large person and its fellow creatures have known periods when they believed in an immaterial God. You must fully understand that everything is in everything. At this moment, in an atom of your arm, millions of worlds are being born and others are dying, believing or not believing in a God and a soul. And when a millennium has gone by for you, the gigantic being of whom the sun is an atom has only had the time to take one step. Time is in fact inversely proportional to the mass, or rather to the level of the form of life. But everything in the universe is alive and in harmony with the infinitely large and the infinitely small. The Earth is alive, like all the planets, and for the small growth that is humanity, it is difficult to notice this because of the time lag due to the enormous difference in mass, which prevents you from perceiving its palpitations. Nor could one of our red blood cells, or better still, one of the atoms that make up our body, imagine that it forms with its peers a living being. Finally, whatever happens to each individual, the universal balance remains constant. But if we want to be happy at our level, we must live in harmony with the infinitely large, the infinitely small, and with our fellow human beings. No argument aiming to support the existence of any type of God or soul can be sustained when we glimpse, however briefly, the infinite nature of the universe. No heaven could exist in any particular place because since the universe is infinite, it cannot have a center. Besides, as I have already explained, there cannot be any communication between an infinitely large entity and a universe of infinitely small entities, because the difference in mass is too great, thus creating a difference in the flow of equivalent time. Finally, if one can imagine an immortal soul escaping from the body after death, an image that is very poetic but rather naive since it comes from the minds of primitives, one cannot imagine where it would go, given that the universe is infinite. The quantity of energy that flies off at the time of death disperses in a random way, losing all identity as it blends with all the energy suspended in the surrounding air. That identity is obviously engraved only in organized matter, such as the cells of a living being that has just died. This matter is organized according to the blueprint which the genes of the male and the female determined at conception while creating the first cell. With regard to the origin of life on Earth, some people might say your explanation doesn't change a thing, since you cannot say what there was at the very beginning. This is a foolish comment, which proves that the person who makes it has no awareness of infinity that exists in time as well as in space. There is neither a beginning nor an end to matter, since nothing is lost, nothing is created, everything is transformed, as you have already heard it said. Only the form of matter can change according to the wishes of those who have reached a scientific level which allows them to accomplish this. It is the same for the infinite levels of life. That is what the second part of our emblem represents. The Star of David, which is composed of two intertwined triangles, means, as above, so below. With the swastika, which signifies that everything is cyclic in the middle of a six-pointed star, you have our emblem, which contains all the wisdom in the world. You can also find the two symbols together in ancient writings like the Bardo Thodol or the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and in many other writings as well. It is evidently very difficult for a finite human brain to be conscious of infinity, which explains the need to limit the universe in time and space by belief in one or several gods that are made responsible for everything. Indeed, those who cannot reach a sufficient level of human understanding towards the universe have trouble accepting the notion of infinity, which makes humanity nothing exceptional, but merely people situated in a particular time and place in the infinite universe. People obviously prefer things to be well defined, well framed, limited in a way, in the image of their own minds. Those who ask themselves if it is possible that there is life on other planets are the best example of those limited minds. And we liked very much the comparison you made during one of your lectures, likening such people to frogs at the bottom of their own pond, wondering whether there was life in other ponds.
Paradise on Earth.
You could very soon live in a genuine terrestrial paradise, if only the technology that you have at your disposal today were made to serve human well-being instead of serving violence, armies, or the personal profit of a few. Science and technology can totally liberate humanity, not only from the problems of hunger in the world, but also from the obligation to work, to live, since machines can quite easily look after the daily chores by themselves, thanks to automation. Already, in some of your most modern factories where it used to take several hundred people to build one car, Now only a single individual is needed to oversee a computer that commands and carries out all the car building operations. In the future, even that one person will be unnecessary. Workers' unions are not happy about this because factories are in less and less need of personnel and are letting more and more workers go. Still, the unions are wrong. These fantastic machines which do the work of 500 people should enable those 500 to really live, rather than enrich only one person, their boss. No individual should be in the service of another, nor work for anyone for a salary. Machines can easily do all the chores and take care of all the work, enabling people to dedicate themselves to the one thing for which they were created, to think, create, and blossom. That is what happens on our planet. Your children must no longer be raised according to the 3 primitive precepts of work, family, and country. On the contrary, they should be brought up following the principles of development, freedom, and universal fraternity. Work is not sacred when it is motivated only by the need to earn just enough to live a laborious life of hardship. It is even terribly degrading to sell oneself and one's life in order to eat by doing jobs which simple machines could do. The family has never been anything but a way for ancient as well as modern supporters of slavery to force people to work harder for an illusory ideal. Finally, patriotism is still only a supplementary means of creating competition between people and urging them to perform their sacrosanct work with greater ardour each day. What is more, those 3 concepts of work, family, and country have always been supported by primitive religions, but now you are no longer primitive people. Shake off all those dusty old principles and make the most of your life on earth, which science can transform into paradise. Do not be taken in by those who speak to you of potential enemies and allow armament factories to compel underpaid workers to produce destructive weapons that bring profits to big industrialists. Do not be taken in by those who speak to you in horror of the falling birth rate, because young people understand that they need not have so many children, and that it is better to have fewer so they can be happier. Do not be taken in by those who constantly brandish remarks under your nose saying things like, neighbouring peoples are multiplying and could become a threat. They are the same people who support the stockpiling of nuclear weapons under the pretext of deterrence. Finally, do not let yourself be taken in by those who tell you that military service enables you to learn how to use a gun and that it can always be useful, while they continue to pile up nuclear missiles. They want to teach you violence, to teach you not to be afraid of killing a person like yourself, using the excuse that he is wearing a different uniform and training you until it becomes a mechanical reflex after repeated practice against training targets. Do not be taken in by those who tell you that you must fight for your country. No country deserves it. Do not be influenced by those who say to you, what if enemies invade our country? Shouldn't we defend ourselves? Answer that non-violence is always more efficient than violence. It is not proven that those who died for France were right, no matter how hostile their aggressors were. Look at the triumph of Gandhi in India. Such people will tell you that you must fight for your liberty, but they forget that the Gauls lost their war against the Romans and that the French are no worse off for being descendants of the conquered, having benefited from the civilization of the conquerors. Live rather in fulfillment, freedom and love, instead of listening to all those narrow-minded, aggressive people. The most important aid you have to help you reach a long and lasting universal peace is television, the source of a genuine planetary awareness that makes it possible to see what goes on every day all over the globe, and realize that the barbarians who live on the other side of the border have all the same joys, the same sorrows, and the same problems as yourselves. It also records the progress of science, the latest artistic creations, and so on. Of course, it is important to ensure that this wonderful tool of diffusion and communication does not fall into the hands of people who would use it to condition the mass of the people by providing biased information. You really can consider television to be the nervous system of humanity, which enables each individual to be aware of the existence of others and to see how they live. It also prevents the spread of distorted ideas about others that create a fear of strangers. Long ago there was fear of the neighbouring tribe, then fear of the neighbouring village, of the neighbouring province, and of the neighbouring state. There is currently a fear of the neighbouring race, and if this no longer existed, there would be fear of potential aggressors coming from another planet. It is necessary to reverse this attitude and to be open to everything that comes from the outside, because all fear of strangers is proof of a primitive level of civilization. In this sense, television is irreplaceable, and is possibly the most important development of any civilization, because, in the same way as radio, it enables all those isolated cells of humanity, which people are, to be informed at all times of what the others are doing. As already indicated, it works exactly as the nervous system does in the body of a living being.
The other world.
You are probably wondering where you are, my guide said. In fact, you are now on a base located relatively close to the Earth. In the first message you noted that we travelled 7 times faster than the speed of light. That was true 25,000 years ago when we landed on Earth. Since then, we have made much progress, and we now travel through space much faster. It only takes us a few moments to make the journey that used to take us almost 2 months in those times, and we continue to progress. If you will now follow me, we will take a little trip together. I rose and followed my 3 guides. We went through an airlock, and in a vast room I noticed a craft similar to the one that had brought me from Earth, but it was far larger. The exterior must have been about 12 meters in diameter, and inside it had 4 seats facing each other instead of just 2. We sat down as before, and again I felt the same sensation of intense cold, but it lasted much longer this time, about 10 minutes. Then the craft rocked slightly, and we stepped out through the trapdoor exit. Before me, a paradisical landscape unfolded, and in fact, I cannot find any words to describe my enchantment at seeing huge flowers, each more beautiful than the last, and animals of unimaginable appearance that were walking among them. There were birds with multicoloured plumage, and pink and blue squirrels with the heads of bear cubs climbing in the branches of trees that bore both enormous fruit and gigantic flowers. About 30 meters from the spacecraft, a small group of Elohim was waiting for us, and behind the trees I was able to make out a group of buildings that resembled brightly coloured shells, harmonizing perfectly with the vegetation. The temperature was very mild, and the air was perfumed with countless scents of exotic flowers. We walked towards the top of a hill, and a marvellous panorama began to appear. Innumerable small streams wound through the lush vegetation, and far off, an azure sea sparkled in the sun. Reaching a clearing, I discovered with great astonishment a group of people similar to me, by which I mean people resembling those who live on Earth, not Elohim. Most of them were naked, or wore robes made of multicoloured silks. They bowed respectfully before my 3 guides, and then we all sat down. Our armchairs seemed to have been carved in the rock and were covered with thick furs that always remained fresh and comfortable despite the warmth. Some people came out of a small cave located right next to us and approached, carrying trays piled high with fruits, grilled meats accompanied by the most incredible sauces, and drinks of unforgettable flavours. Behind each guest, 2 of the men who carried the trays were kneeling, ready to satisfy the slightest wish of those who were eating. The latter would ask them for whatever they desired without even looking at them. During the meal, some marvellous music had started up, from where I could not tell, and young naked women with figures as sculptured as those of the waiters started to dance with incomparable grace on the surrounding lawn. There must have been some 40 guests who were similar to people from Earth, in addition to my 3 guides. There were white, yellow and black men and women who all spoke a language I could not understand that resembled Hebrew. I was sitting to the right of the Elohim whom I'd met 2 years earlier, and to the left of the 2 other Elohim. Facing me sat a young bearded man, very handsome and very slim. He wore a mysterious smile and an expression filled with fraternal feeling. To his right was a man with a noble face sporting a black beard that was very thick and very long. To his left was a more corpulent man with an Asian face. He had a shaven head.